Well, first and foremost, welcome back, everyone. On behalf of the committee, it is really wonderful to see everyone back here, face to face, as it should be. These have been extraordinary times, but thank you all for your patience and indeed your continuing support for the Roman Archaeology group, and by extension also the discipline group of Classics and Ancient History at this university. Today we're going to be looking at Roman Britain, but more precisely we're going to be looking at, I guess, the historiography of Roman Britain in a paper I'm calling The Discovery of Roman Britain. Today we're not going to be looking at, indeed, some of the more obvious places to start. I mean, this is not going to be the debate about Romanization, the sort of Francis Haverfield stuff. Rather, I'd like to focus on a period between the 12th and 17th centuries. Because it's in this period we see, I guess, not only a resurgence in the interest in the antiquities of Britain, but also an interest in the physical remains of Roman Britain. And it goes without saying that this story, the story of Roman Britain, is one that is always evolving. And now you can't have a lecture without a video. So just to set the scene for this evolving story, my commitment to providing you with the most up-to-date information is clear from the choice of video.
Doorsteps, under the doorsteps in fact, have been discovered the ruins of a Roman temple where 2,000 years ago the conquerors of Britain came to worship their god Mithras. A marble bust of the god, unearthed and taken to the British Museum, is comparatively unharmed after 20 centuries. Both neck and head are in good repair, though parts of the god's headdress are in danger of crumbling. After further cleaning operations, under the supervision of expert Dr. Harold Plenderleith, the crumbling parts are to be strengthened. The most remarkable archaeological discovery ever made in this country, the Temple of Mithras is the only Roman building in London of which we have a complete plan. The god itself was found inside the temple, under the basement of a building not 200 yards from the mansion house. Matchsticks and cotton wool are used to apply solutions which can remove iron stains and other blemishes without harming the marble. Altogether, the renovation work will take months to complete. When it was first unearthed, coated with centuries of dirt, the bust looked nothing like the relic which can soon take its place among Britain's historical treasures. Before and after. To the Guildhall Museum have gone most of the other relics found on the city site. Here, getting a wash and scrub, precious pieces of Roman pottery are quickly restored to their former beauty. Best of the Guildhall collection is the beautifully carved head of Serapis, god of the underworld. Two others in good condition are this statue of a reclining figure, possibly of Mercury, the messenger of the gods, and this Bacchus group. A treble life-size hand, thought to be part of a Mithras figure, tablets clearly and beautifully inscribed, and the head of the goddess Minerva complete the collection of relics found on the Mithras temple site. Works of art as well as historical treasures, they are 2,000-year-old reminders of the days when London was called Londinium.
So, it's a useful video to begin with as well. obviously documenting the early days of the recovery of that particular site. And indeed, the London Mithraeum has once again opened up to the public in recent years, probably about, 4 or so years ago. But the site of Roman London continues to yield important evidence for the writing of the history of Roman Britain. And perhaps most sensational of all recent discoveries are the so-called Bloomberg tablets. These have been recently published in the last 4 years or so by Roger Tomlin in a volume, Roman London's First Voices, writing tablets from the first excavations. And this particular book is available for free, thanks to a grant. So it can be downloaded off the website. And it contains the text and translations of the various Bloomberg tablets of a sort which are similar to, let's say, the Vindolanda writing tablets, which many of you will already be familiar. So this is an evolving story because it's always dependent on new finds. But not only that, it's an evolving story because we continue to have different ways of telling the story. And occasionally it can prove controversial. Here we have what has to be described as a fairly harmless documentary which was made a few years ago for children and was put out by the BBC. Yet, this documentary, for its decision to portray the Romans, or the Romano-British as including persons of colour, sparked an outrage among the usual suspects on the political right, and a similar sort of backlash from the other side as well. So there is the question of how does one tell the story? What aspects of the story of Roman Britain does one focus on? But then there's the other question of whose story is it? Is the history of Roman Britain essentially a Roman story, the history of the Roman Empire, or a province of the Roman Empire? Is it a British story, or is it an English story? And for the latter, many of you may own copies of this set. And of course, Volume 1, Roman Britain. In the first edition, it was Roman Britain and the English Settlements, Collingwood and Myers. In the second edition, it was by Peter Salway. But the history of England begins with Roman Britain. And so the implication is that in order to understand the history of England, not of the British Isles or anything like that, the history of England, you start with Britain. And so therefore, is it an English story? Whose story is it? And this is a question which is going to underpin not only modern historiography on Roman Britain, but also, if we turn back the centuries to the 12th century, we find these basic questions underpinning these earlier accounts. Let's begin with the 12th century. This here is what remains of the great church at Malmesbury in Wiltshire. Not all of this building survives, as you can tell. In fact, we've only got a part of this once great church. It is in Malmesbury that the great Saxon king Athelstan is said to be buried. But it's an author of the 12th century, William of Malmesbury, who I think represents a good place to begin this story. William of Malmesbury was a 12th century writer. He was the author of several important historical works. A history of the bishops of England, a history of his own time, but also a nifty little bestseller called The History of the Kings of England. And as with all works of historiography, it's always a good idea to begin with the preface, because in the preface or the prologue, the author often states their intention for why they are writing their work. If we look at what William says in his prologue, he says the following. He says, "This is my undertaking, if only the favour of heaven smile upon my adventure and steer me past the rocks of rough and rugged style. But if anyone, as the poet says, if any moved by love, read these poor words, let him be warned that I guarantee the truth of nothing in past time except the sequence of events." Now this is a translation. He's writing in Latin. But there's more to it than that. The connection with the Roman past isn't just his choice of language. Rather, his whole conception of the history of the kings of England begins with Julius Caesar. So his work begins with the advent of Julius Caesar in 55 BC. Some of you, this might sound a little bit flippant, but some of you may remember the comic book 1066 and all that, where I think Julius Caesar was the first date in British history. There's that joke about, it was a good thing because they brought a classical education with them, or something like that. William of Malmesbury, I think in his own way, would have agreed, but he wouldn't have seen the joke. He is an author who very much was conscious of not only the political history of the Roman occupation of Britain, but particularly this question of his style, his use of Latin. And it goes beyond just his choice of language, because of course he even decides to drop a few tags from the classics. So that line about, if any be moved by love, read these poor words, this is in fact from Virgil, the sixth eclogue. So this is someone who is casting or presenting the fabric of his history, one might say, in a very Roman style. Now, his knowledge of the history of the Roman period is not based on, as we may assume, on material evidence. Far from it. William of Malmesbury is following the literary sources, and for the most part he's following the work of the great Saxon historian Bede. But it's this combination of not only Bede, but also various Latin poets, and indeed some late antique writers as well, Eutropius and so on, are furnishing him with the bare bones of his early narrative. Something very similar can be seen in the work of a direct contemporary of William of Malmesbury, Henry, Archdeacon of Huntington. Henry of Huntington's work begins in much the same way as that of William of Malmesbury. It's a history of the English, yet it begins after a geographical survey of the British Isles, following Bede. He begins his history properly with the Roman occupation. It's a history of Roman emperors before he turns to the history of the Saxon and then post-Saxon kings. This is, as you can see, a manuscript of Book 5 of Henry's work. I put this up here because this is from the collection of Sir Robert Cotton, who will play a role in a few minutes in our story. Henry of Huntington, in some ways, is slightly less ambitious than William of Malmesbury. He's more content to, I'm tempted to say, plagiarize the work of Bede, particularly for these early books. But there's more going on when we look at Henry's work. Not least because in the first book, chapter 6 of his History of the English, he actually includes a poem of his own creation, written in hexameter verse. And the poem is about the great cities of England. The choice of hexameter is, of course, important because this is suggestive of, I guess, an epic, heroic meter. And that is, of course, he sees his history as being an epic of its sort, an epic of the English, as it were. A historian of a very different stripe, however, is the third of our 12th century historians, a certain Geoffrey of Monmouth. Now, of the three, Geoffrey is perhaps the most famous. You can always tell the most famous because if they get a Penguin Classics edition, that's always a good mark. Some may balk at the idea of Geoffrey of Monmouth being called a historian at all. It's far more conventional to talk about him as a historical romancer. And indeed, this is essentially, at least from our perspective, a work of fiction. His history doesn't begin with Julius Caesar. It, in fact, goes back far further. He begins with the mythical story of the Trojan Brutus, who fled Italy. So following the death of Aeneas, he fled Italy and eventually arrived in Britain. Now, the whole purpose of this story is it's a direct parallel of the flight of Aeneas from Troy to found Rome. And this is an important thing to observe, that all three of our authors are looking for the origins of the English, not in more recent history, but in the distant past. But more precisely, the Roman past. And that's important in terms of the way in which these authors are fashioning the inheritance of Rome. In the preface to Geoffrey's work, he says the following. He says, "Whenever I have chanced to think about history of the kings of Britain, on those occasions when I have been turning over a great many such matters in my mind, it has seemed a remarkable thing to me that, apart from such mention of them as Gildas and Bede had each made in a brilliant book on the subject, I have not been able to discover anything at all on those kings who lived there before the incarnation of Christ, or indeed about Arthur and all the others who followed on after the incarnation. Yet the deeds of these men were such that they deserve to be praised for all time. What is more, these deeds were handed joyfully down in an oral tradition, just as if they had been committed to writing by many peoples who had only their memory to rely on." Indeed, there's almost something sort of quite modern, almost something of the anthropologist about the approach of Geoffrey of Monmouth when we read passages like that. And although these stories that he tells may be regarded as fiction, they are nevertheless important insofar as they suggest ways in which the inhabitants of the British Isles thought about their past. And thought about their past not in a written tradition that we see in the likes of Bede and then our 12th century authors, but in an oral tradition which existed apart from that. So we can note, if we look at these three 12th century authors, some common characteristics. First of all is the identification of a continuity between the Roman past and the non-Roman present. And so rather than the Roman period marking an interlude in the history of the island, rather it is an integrated part of it. More than this, the Romans appear, particularly in the works of Henry of Huntington and William of Malmesbury, as the paradigms of imperial power and rulership. So all subsequent kings in some ways are spiritual descendants of the Roman emperors. And finally, in the case of Geoffrey, the Romans are used to create a sense of a greater antiquity for the island by effectively tying the history of Britain into the Trojan War cycle. So if we skip forward a few centuries, in the late Tudor and Jacobean period, we see something of a revolution in the way in which people approached the history of Britain. Yet I would also like you to keep in mind some of those 12th century examples when we come to the end. It's almost conventional to tell this story through the prism or through the example of William Camden. For those of you who are interested in Camden, I think the best introductory essay on Camden and his time is one by Hugh Trevor Roper, later Lord Dacre, later the guy who was foiled by the Hitler diaries, but that's a little bit unfair. Hugh Trevor Roper, great historian, particularly of the 17th century. His essay, Queen Elizabeth's First Historian, William Camden, in his Renaissance essays from 1985, is an excellent place to start. So Camden, who was this man? Well, he was born in 1551. He was educated in London at Christ's Hospital and then St. Paul's School. He was not from a particularly wealthy or distinguished family, yet in 1566 he went up to Oxford. He matriculated as a student at Magdalen College. If we bear in mind the historical context for the latter half of the 16th century, this was an incredibly important time in English intellectual history, and particularly at Oxford. Oxford, at this point, was a hotbed of religious controversies, but also it was a place where new subjects were being taught. Geography, various sciences were becoming more and more important. But it was also at Oxford that William Camden started forming some of his first and perhaps most important intellectual friendships. It was at Oxford that he met, for example, Sir Philip Sidney, individuals who possessed a strong antiquarian knowledge. Camden's time at Oxford was not an entire academic success, however. In 1571, he left the university without taking a bachelor's degree, although he did return for his examinations and gained his Bachelor of Arts in 1574. Although he attempted to gain a fellowship, he was repeatedly passed over at All Souls. If his ambitions, however, at Oxford had been thwarted, It was as a schoolmaster that he made a name for himself. In 1575, he was appointed to the position of undermaster at Westminster School and served as headmaster of that school between 1593 and 1597. It was during this period that Camden was working on the work which is most well known, the Britannia. But this wasn't his only intellectual activity. He also wrote a Greek grammar, and indeed Westminster was one of the first schools in England to teach Greek. This time at Westminster, though, was the crucial moment in his great enterprise on the Britannia. Because it was at this time that he was at Westminster that he came into contact with the aforementioned Sir Robert Cotton, the great bibliophile. But Camden and Cotton would travel on or go on a number of journeys, exploring the antiquities of England and the British Isles. And perhaps most important for the story of Roman Britain, in 1599, Cotton and Camden went to Hadrian's Wall. And their observations on the wall would be incorporated into subsequent editions of the Britannia, the editions of 1600 and also 1607. Before that, for his first editions of the Britannia, Camden was dependent on either ancient sources for the wall or on the work of local antiquaries, earlier local antiquaries such as Leyland. But the Britannia is, of course, his great work. What was the purpose of this work? Well, again, let us look at the preface to the work. The preface to the second edition states quite clearly, it says, to acquaint the world with the ancient state of Britain, to restore Britain to antiquity and antiquity to Britain, and to recover, as far as possible, a certainty in our affairs, which either the carelessness of writers or the credulity of readers has taken from us. It's more than this. The Britannia is more than just an attempt to restore Britain to antiquity and antiquity to Britain. The Britannia is an intensely patriotic work, as observed in a recent article by Oliver Harris in the Antiquities Journal. Indeed, if we look at the preface to the first edition, which was published in 1586, there are 5 mentions in the preface alone to Camden's love of his country. And if we turn to the subsequent edition of 1607, the references to the love of his country actually increases to 9 in the preface alone. But when we're thinking about the Britannia, it's an important work for another reason, as acutely observed by Hugh Trevor Roper. In fact, Trevor Roper notes 2 key points about the Britannia. Firstly, the presence of a coherent philosophy, quote, an organic historical continuity from the earliest times to the Tudor period. The other thing that Trevor Roper notes is the cosmopolitan view that Camden adopts in the work. And the work may have been about the antiquities of an island, but Camden's outlook was by no means insular. Like many of his historiographical precursors, such as William of Malmesbury and Henry of Huntington, Camden wrote his work in Latin. But very soon, or relatively soon, it was translated during his lifetime into English. And the famous English example, or in English translation, is that by Philemon Holland. This work, in its English translation, was a major work when it came to particularly 17th century's conception, the conception of the past in the 17th century. In fact, the poet John Davies comments on the greatness of, or the importance rather, of Holland's translation. Just a few lines from Davies. He says, "For now the English knows his worthiness," that is to say, Camden's. "His countrymen now see him how he is. Before they at his virtue could but guess, and guess by artless aims that often miss." Camden's work is important not only for his erudition or anything like that, but the way in which he starts incorporating not only knowledge of antiquities, but also consideration of, for example, the topography of particular regions. It sort of struck me with Professor Kennedy's talk earlier today, beginning the discussion of the cities with aerial photography, looking at the geographical context for these cities. That's exactly what Camden does as well. And he is writing, that is to say, Camden is writing at a time when there is a revolution in cartography. And it's no real surprise that Camden befriended the great cartographer of the age, Abraham Ortelius. Indeed, Camden and Ortelius met in 1577, so before the publication of the Britannia. And from Ortelius's perspective, Ortelius was particularly interested in finding the locations of ancient sites. And so his interests in mapping the ancient world very much went hand in hand with that of Camden, who was interested in also plotting the ancient world on a map. Indeed, in 1595, so 6 years after the initial publication of the Britannia, Ortelius produced his atlas, the Parergon Atlas of the Ancient World. And here we have, of course, the map of Britain. This here is 1590 printing of Camden's Britannia. And just to give you a sense of his incorporation of different sorts of material, the fact that he's no longer bound like his 12th century predecessors on what was written earlier. We can see, for example, his references to coins, and in some cases we know exactly the coin that he's talking about when it comes to these in terms of his work. Later printings, and this is an early 18th century printing of the Britannia, present the history in a way that's almost quite modern. It's a sort of thing you could expect to find if you're looking at Collingwood and Wright's Roman inscriptions of Britain. This cataloguing of inscriptional evidence, but also the attempt to draw that evidence, similarly with the coinage here. So this is an expanded version of Camden's original, which incorporates epigraphic, numismatic evidence, as well as the literary sources as well. We can also get some clues when we look at the structure of Camden's work if we're thinking about what Trevor Roper talked about as the philosophy of history. The structure of the work incorporates both the pre-Roman history of the island, what we would think of as the Iron Age period, also Roman Britain, but also Saxon Britain. And the work is structured around the counties of Britain, Scotland, and Ireland. And in most instances, the history of the counties is tied to the pre-Roman names of the areas. For example, the Trinovantes and Middlesex go together, or the Iceni in Suffolk and Norfolk. And you can notice that if you look at this page up here, where you've got the tribal name and then the contemporary county name as well. And so I would suggest that this is part of his attempt to restore the present to the past. Camden, as we've already seen from his engagement with Ortelius, but it's important to note that Camden is not operating in a vacuum. Indeed, Camden's county-by-county approach was foreshadowed by the work of the poet, bibliophile, and writer and antiquarian John Leyland. Moreover, the process of mapping Britain was a major endeavour of this late Tudor Jacobean period. Here we have the work of John Speed, his Theatre of the Empire of Great Britain from 1611. Speed is basing a lot of his material on that of Camdens Britannia. But of course it's not only people like Speed and Ortelius who are interested in mapping, but we have George and Robert Carew, George Owen, etc. Norden as well. But it's interesting to note that this antiquarianism, this interest in the past, is not only confined to the world of history or cartography. It can be seen in another quarter as well. The famous legal writer Sir Edward Coke was Camden's almost exact contemporary. Now, Coke, although known primarily as one of the first early modern thinkers to attribute great significance to Magna Carta, was also interested in finding the origins of English law, and particularly English law in a pre-Norman past. Thus, for someone like Sir Edward Coke, the Anglo-Saxon period and the Roman period and even the pre-Roman period held a position of prominence in his what has been described by Christopher Hill as his legal historical myth-making. And if I may read out a passage from Hill's chapter on Coke to put this into further context. Cook's second great contribution was more directly political, but he followed naturally from the liberalisation of the common law. His tremendous labours achieved what Camden, Stowe, Speed and Rowley had failed to do. They gave Englishmen an historical myth of the English constitutional parallel to Fox's myth of the English religion. In primitive times, Englishmen had good laws, as they had a pure church. The continuous enjoyment of these laws had been broken by William the Conqueror, with the support of the Pope, and by many of his successors. But Englishmen had fought back, as the heretics had fought back, with greater success. Magna Carta and the parliamentary statutes which Cook interpreted so lovingly and so inaccurately were monuments to the eternal vigilance with which God's Englishmen had defended their liberties. And if we turn to a passage of Cook's own writings, and this is from 1605, you get a real sense of this patriotic interpretation of legal history. Cook says, in a legal tract, he says, "No subject of this realm, but being truly instructed by the good and plain evidence of his ancient and undoubted patrimony and birthright." He goes on, he says, "The ancient and excellent laws of England are the birthright of the most ancient and best inheritance of the subjects of the realm have, for by them enjoyeth not only his inheritance and goods in safety." So there's this impulse to look to the past in order to justify the present. And in a slightly more flowery piece from Michael Drayton, also direct contemporary of Camden's, we have the following. "Oh, that ocean did not bound our style with these strict and narrow limits so, but that melody of our sweet isle might now be heard to Tiber, Arne, and Po. That they know how far Thames doth outgo the music of declined Italy." So once again, this direct contrast and comparison with classical antiquity, Italian antiquity. So, how do we bring all this together? We've looked at we've had a bit of a look at two periods in particular. We've looked at the 12th century and the late 16th, early 17th century. It is perhaps not too much of an overstatement to say that the history of Roman Britain has always been tied to contemporary political or social trends and concerns. And by saying that, I'm thinking not only of the 16th and the 12th centuries, but also of the 21st centuries as well. In the case of those 12th century authors, they were interested in the assertions of imperial continuity. For William of Malmesbury and Henry of Huntington, the lineage of the Anglo-Norman kings could be traced back to the Roman emperors. And that was important. That gave them that deep political power and history. And for Geoffrey of Monmouth, in a slightly different way, Geoffrey of Monmouth has a slightly different conception of history. He sees it as a far more cyclical affair. But nevertheless, his attempt to build on that myth of Brutus, the Trojan, is about tying the history of Britain into a deeper antiquity, to the Trojan War cycle. In the Tudor and Jacobean period, although we see certain trends which in a way foreshadow the way in which we would approach the history of Roman Britain, the focus on material culture, for example, which is so much at the heart of these antiquarian writings. Nevertheless, these works are not without their political point. The Roman period is once again part of a deeper antiquity of the island. But one gets a sense as well that although Camden was interested in restoring Britain to antiquity, or England to antiquity, as he puts it, we see in the work of some of his contemporaries, there's also an assertion of independence, an English independence from the continent, which again, this may be my post-Brexit reading that's influencing this here, but I think it's something that we can certainly see. And of course it makes perfect sense in Protestant England. England after the Reformation, after the break with the Church at Rome, after the conflict with Imperial Spain. The writers of this period are looking not only to assert their deep antiquity, but also their independence from the continent. So on that note, I'll pause, but of course, happy to I won't say answer any questions, but attempt to answer any questions you may have. Thank you very much for your time.
Division of the word in Doorsteps that Borges decided, and we're going to go our own way. Yeah, I think that's a valid point.
Yes, this is not necessarily directly related to lecture, but as you were talking about the mapping of England and that period that it was done, I was trying to remember the name of, I've read about a person in that period who did travel through England and was discovering mapping. I'm not quite sure what it was. When you mentioned the name Rediscovery, that rang a bell with me. Do you know anything about journeys or writings of journeys and then lift writings up that were done at that time? Through England, discovering England, mapping it, looking at places of historical sort of antiquity. Is Leyland, is that a name that rings a bell?
Yes.
Someone who did that?
Yes, he's one of several, actually. I mean, John Speed is another one that we've looked at, but yes, and so, yes, in many cases we get this, a number of journals, I guess you could say, itineraries, where they are describing their journeys from place to place, but they're paying particular notice of these antiquities themselves. But there's a whole raft of these authors. Yeah.
The name, I think of when you said Leyland, that it rang a bell. I'll build on that.
Excellent.
What about the historians of Victorian England when when they instead of focusing so much on the thing of England's independence, but they were at the time they were England was building overseas empires with more direct comparisons with the Roman Empire.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, if you read, I mean, a great example of this is Haverfield's famous lecture on the Romanisation of Britain, which is what, 1906, I think, somewhere around about that. And it's quite interesting his use of pronouns. It's only never quite sure if he's talking about the Romans or the British in terms of his empire builders. And so, yeah, I mean, these are forces which always inform the way people frame the story. Yes?
You use the word English. Now, my recollection from many years ago at school was the Romans turned up and sort of moved the locals to the extremities, which became sort of Cornwall and Wales and Scotland. So do you sort of include that group within your term of English?
Well, I mean, very, very good observation. I mean, and certainly when we're dealing with the Roman period, it's probably better to either talk about the Britons if we're looking for a collective term for the inhabitants of what would later become England. But as you say, I mean, there are issues there. But I think what's quite interesting is that with many of these 12th century authors, they're using this term English as a sort of a global term, even though, of course, it refers to the descendants of the Angles and the Saxons, but they're using this as the term for the inhabitants of the island, which, of course, is even going up into the 20th century. If we think of the way in which people constructed Englishness as a sort of catch-all term, the Oxford History of England, even though this is a work which covers the pre-Saxon period, and indeed, if we look at some of the later volumes, it's looking at histories, imperial histories outside of the British Isles as well. So I guess the very term English is one that's constantly being redefined, and particularly in the 20th and 21st centuries. You know, the sorts of people who would self-identify as Englishmen in 1900 are very different from those who would self-identify as English in 2011. As particularly with the growth of smaller identities, and the assertion of Scottish identity, Welsh identity, and so on. Yes.
Perhaps more a comment than a question about Sir Edward Cook in particular, and you made the point that he sought to try and connect back to ancient institutions and laws. I suppose he wasn't just a writer, he was a judge as much as a writer, and he was very much involved in the conflict with James I and upholding the law against the divine right of kings and so on, and I think that's an element in the things that he said, and maybe my twist of the hill was a bit unkind to him in some respects.
Yeah, but you're absolutely right, and I guess that's sort of so much about his assertion of Magna Carta, or the interpretation of Magna Carta, but also I guess that question of individual property rights, as opposed to the power of, let's say, the king, is a really good point.
That's something I'm not familiar with either, but when you saw the history excerpts from the actual books, first thing I pointed to was that Claudius, tribune of the people, Latin, but an English writer at the time would be thinking or asking questions, what is a tribune of the people? And it's in that period of the early Stuarts when you had that clash between the authoritarian divine right of kings versus the king is meant to be working in consultation with the people and the aristocracy, and they'll link it. The writers, I'm wondering how much writers are linking back to the Roman idea of the Senate, the tribunes of the people, and the assembly of the people. They're doing it this way, in a sort of a side way to avoid censorship from the Stuart monarch.
Yeah, no, it's a good point, and I'll need to it'd be interesting to see how that sort of plays out in someone like Camden. You can see it in a lot of other authors who are dealing more directly with the literary sources, who are dealing with Tacitus and so on, where these issues of Libertas and so on really come up and become quite political. And indeed, think of the importance of even someone like Livy, for that sort of republican virtue, for slightly earlier, but sort of Machiavellian and so on. So yeah, no, it's playing out all over the place. This engagement with the classical past. Really good observation. And there's a question from the back, I think, to Paul, was there? Yes.
Out of interest, how do you link in the English language, or the origins of the English language, and the so-called British English history that you're talking about here?
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, in terms of, are you talking about in terms of when does history start being written in the vernacular rather than in Latin or so on?
And the language itself.
And the language itself, yeah. In many instances, it depends on who's writing, but the heyday of Latin, lasts, quite a ways through, in the fact that, I guess even just in the case of Camden, although he's involved with the various attempts to translate his work, he adds a lot of material, for example, to Holland's translation. He doesn't do it himself, which is really interesting. For someone like Camden, the proper expression of this is in Latin. No doubt because he's envisaging a readership beyond the British Isles, so he's seeing his readers on the continent as well. And of course, Latin is that language of scholarship, and will continue to be for certainly 100 years or so after Camden's time. Yes?
I've got a question around English names. Back in Caesar, like the Caesar part meant ruler, I believe, or something like that, but for the most part, it seems that these 12th century English authors have got a name and then where they're from, and that's how they're designated. Was that just conventional, or did they not have surnames back then?
I'm not sure when we start seeing English surnames. I mean, there is often a connection between someone's surname and the place of origin, which is why we often get the sort of, William of X or Henry of, Y. But I'm not sure at what point we start to see the developments of that. I mean, of course, with the Roman names, you've got, the trianonymous, so it's a where you have those family names plus the trinomen and the cognomen as well. But with the English language, those Germanic languages, we tend to, it's not quite like that.
I noticed that group the 12th and 16th century authors that you mentioned into the two categories, person of place versus person with surname, it seemed to be quite strict in the delineation between those two groups, so the transition must have happened sometime between the 12th and 16th centuries, I'm guessing.
I'm afraid I can't help you on that one.
The Camden bloke, which century was he writing in, please?
So William Camden's writing the latter half of the 16th century and the beginning of the 17th.
I suppose that because Camden's a place, right? If you wanted to follow this, with the surname taken from a place, I'm guessing.
Right, well, that's just about it. David, would you like to wrap up proceedings?
I suspect that Camden took his surname from a professorship at Brasenose College. Maybe in the other way around.
I think it's the other way around.
Okay, thought I'd try that anyway. Thank you very much, Chris, for your lecture, and thank you very much. And thank you for organising the day as well. Since I'm no longer on the staff, I can't book rooms. At least that's the excuse I'm using for asking Chris to book the rooms each time. It's always been a bit of a nightmare in recent years to get room bookings done. Thank you too for not losing sight of us and turning up in such numbers today. Hopefully we can have more of these meetings coming up. I don't want to give too many hostages to fortune by planning out the rest of the season, but ideally we'll try and have another lecture in about 4 or 5 weeks' time. So we'll get back to you by email messages to let you know what we're going to be doing. In the light of what Chris has just been talking about, I was to the top of my heap of potential lectures for the future. I thought I might offer one next time round, or perhaps the one after that, on the use by the Emperor Napoleon III, French Emperor Napoleon III, that he makes use of the Caesar's Gallic Wars and wrote a history of Caesar's Gallic Wars as well. Has the battlefields of Gaul reinvestigated and to help legitimise his own dynasty and his own behaviour. It's a fascinating story, so I might get around to dealing with that in a subsequent one of these meetings. Anything else we need to deal with before we go? I think we've probably covered just about everything.
I mean, the final meeting will be the AGM, but that's...
Yeah. Anything else we can answer for you before we go? No? Good. Okay. Thank you very much for coming.